In this, the 12th lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we bring to light the perspectives of a small group of renegade economists who risk professional ostracism by standing up to challenge mainstream economic theory and public policies. For several decades, attorney and editor Louis F. Post had continued to struggle for economic reforms initiated by Henry George. In 1908 and 1910, he made trips to Great Britain, the first to attend the International Free Trade Conference, the second to support Lloyd George's Land for the People campaign. In 1913, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of Labor by President Woodrow Wilson, a position he held throughout Wilson's 8 years in office. In 1927, Post offered his insights on economics, put to a confused and largely disinterested public, hoping to somehow rekindle interest in the pursuit of understanding to which he had come. He wrote, "Fundamental conclusions in economics cannot be based upon unassorted details. Students must concentrate their study upon the big facts, the basic facts, those primary categories which distinctly classify the whole swarm of secondary facts. All rational study of economics must begin with the basic facts and proceed thence to a consideration of details with reference to their basic relations." Post died in 1928. The editor of the Baltimore Sun said of him, "Louis Freeland Post was an outstanding example of the old-time American radical, the man who persistently and intelligently sought root causes for social discontents and economic maladjustments. Clear-headed, kindly, blazingly sincere, and transcendently honest, he won and held the admiration of all fair-minded men, regardless of how they differed with his theories." Criticism of orthodox economics was also being raised by respected economics professors and other writers. One was Eduard Hyman, a German-born professor who came to the United States in 1933 and began teaching at the New School for Social Research. In the History of Economic Doctrines, published in 1945, Hyman later repeated his central concern. He wrote, "The neoclassicists contend that if the pricing process wipes out qualitative differences everywhere in the economic system, then there is no obstacle to the flow of economic activity. The problem is that of deriving a theory of a general disturbance from presuppositions according to which a disturbance is rendered impossible by the regulatory mechanism of the economic system." Yet even Hyman failed to consider Henry George's analysis as providing at least a significant part of the answer. He might have gained some insight from the work of one of his former countrymen, Adolf Damask, who headed Germany's land reform movement from the late 1890s until his death in 1935. In 1919 and 1920, Damask was nominated for the office of President of Germany, and in 1931 he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. His words proved to be quite prophetic. "The social question is lying at the root of life of every nation. The nation which does not find the answer will go to ruin. The nation which does find the answer will find the way open to its highest fulfillment. The decline or ascent of Germany, too, will be decided by it." War had certainly exhausted the resources of the warring nations. If chaos and civil uprisings were to be contained, the old guard and their advisors would need to act quickly and decisively. Most economists of this era were convinced the global economy could be controlled by the central bank tools of monetary contraction or expansion, changes in the levels of reserve requirements, and the so-called discount rate of interest charged to banks for borrowing from the central bank. A question economists grappled with during the 1920s was whether, by extending credit to every sector of the economy, the banks were igniting an inflationary fire, or were they merely adding fuel to a fire already burning. Professor Harry Gunnison Brown, for one, thought the problem could be solved by tying the U.S. dollar with the changing market price for gold. Brown wrote, "It may be desirable eventually to supersede the gold standard with a more stable standard of value, but a more intelligent control of credit by itself would accomplish very much indeed for business and price stability. A dollar redeemable in varying amounts of gold according as gold fluctuated in value relative to other commodities would, however, make possible a more complete stabilization of prices in the long run, even in the absence of foreign cooperation. But if the best results are to be secured, proper control of bank credit should supplement the changing of the weight of gold in which the paper dollar might be made redeemable." The trouble was, the new U.S. currency issued by the Federal Reserve System was not redeemable in gold from the U.S. Treasury. The currency, Federal Reserve notes, are best described as promises to pay nothing in particular. Somewhat surprisingly, redeemable currency, silver certificates, continued to be printed up to 1964. A $1 silver certificate could be redeemed for a $1 silver coin, or even raw silver bullion. Since 1968, they have been redeemable only in Federal Reserve notes. With greater insight than most economists of his day, the historian Frederick Lewis Allen detailed the underlying speculations in land that eventually brought on the stock market crash and the Great Depression. In 1931, he wrote, "At the very outset of the decade, there had been a sensational market in farmlands, caused by the phenomenal prices brought by wheat and other crops during and immediately after the war. Prices of farm property leaped. Thousands of mortgages and loans were based upon these exaggerated values. And when the bottom dropped out of the agricultural markets in 1920 and 1921, the distress of the farmers was intensified by the fact that they could not get money enough from their crops to cover the interest due at the bank or to pay the taxes which were now levied on the increased valuation." What Allen found in his research is that the crash in land prices and land markets ignited a chain reaction of economic and societal troubles. His research provided the details. Thousands of country banks, saddled with mortgages and loans in default, ultimately went to the wall. Just how many of these failures were directly attributable to the undisciplined rise and subsequent fall in real estate prices, it is, of course, impossible to say. But undoubtedly, many of the little country banks which suffered so acutely would never have gone down to ruin if there had been no boom in farmlands. The boom-to-bust cycle in agricultural land was then followed by frenzied land market activity in many of the nation's cities, and intensely along the coast of Florida. Enterprising speculators were selling off Florida one building lot at a time to other speculators, hoping to sell to other speculators, hoping to sell to other speculators, either before payment was due or using borrowed funds from a friendly northern bank. Frederick Lewis Allen detailed how speculation in Florida land sparked the next phase of the crash, as those who managed to extract their investments before the bust moved funds into urban real estate, the stock market, precious metals, or collectibles. Allen wrote, "Again, all through the decade, but especially during its middle years, there was a boom in suburban lands outside virtually every American city. As 4 million discouraged Americans left the farms, the cities grew in size and in stridency." As land prices skyrocketed during the 1920s, skyscrapers went even higher to offset these costs. Buildings were completed even as the demand for new office space disappeared. The history of the Empire State Building in Manhattan is instructive. Construction on the Empire State Building began in 1930, and the grand opening was held the 1st of May, 1931. Much of its office space remained vacant. In its first year of operation, the observation deck took in nearly $2 million, as much money as its owners made leasing floor space that year. The lack of tenants led New Yorkers to deride the building as the empty State Building. The building finally turned a profit in 1950. An intellectual paralysis blinded civic and government leaders, as well as most economists, to the coming economic collapse that hit after 1929. Typical at the time was the optimism expressed by then U.S. President Herbert Hoover. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We have not yet reached the goal, but given a chance, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation. Hoover's optimism was real, but the strength of the United States economy was not. We've reached the end of Lesson 12.